There is a tape recording of Keith Richards snoring. Not a metaphor, not a legend that grew in the retelling. In early May 1965, Richards placed a portable recorder beside his bed in London, fell asleep, and captured 30 seconds of a guitar riff that would become one of the most recognizable songs ever written, followed by roughly 40 minutes of himself unconscious. He had no memory of playing any of it. When he hit play the next morning, his first thought wasn't that he'd done something extraordinary. His first thought was that he must have accidentally recorded somebody else's song, because surely he hadn't written that. He spent about a month convinced he'd somehow plagiarized something that already existed somewhere. He hadn't. That riff, played on a guitar run through a fuzzbox he was using as a rough stand-in for a horn section he assumed would eventually replace it, became the opening of Satisfaction. The iconic sound was, by his own account, a pragmatic accident. The song was created while he was unconscious, by a brain with no conscious pilot at the controls. What Richards had stumbled into, without knowing the terminology or caring about it, is what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi first named a flow state in the 1970s. A condition of deep absorption in which conscious self-monitoring recedes and performance can paradoxically improve. And that's where this gets genuinely strange. The region of Richard's brain that was offline when he wrote that riff, the part responsible for conscious intention, self-monitoring, and deliberate decision-making, turns out to be the same region researchers now believe switches off during flow states. Its absence, it seems, might be less like a bug and more like a feature of creative performance. Which raises a question that's hard to dismiss. If your best ideas arrive when conscious control steps aside, what exactly is your conscious self contributing? The leading framework for understanding this comes from a 2003 paper by neuroscientist Arne Dietrich at the American University of Beirut. Dietrich proposed what he called the Transient Hypofrontality Hypothesis, and the core claim is that during states of deep absorption, flow included, activity in the prefrontal cortex decreases. The prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function, governing deliberate reasoning, self-criticism, abstract planning, and the ongoing internal monologue that quietly informs you your ideas are probably bad. When it steps back, processing shifts toward more automatic, pattern-based systems, including the basal ganglia, structures associated with well-learned skills and procedural memory. The brain doesn't go quiet during flow, according to this model. It reassigns the work. One of the most striking pieces of empirical support for this came from a 2008 fMRI study by Charles Lim and Alan Braun at the National Institutes of Health, in which trained jazz pianists improvised inside a scanner. During free improvisation, Lim and Braun observed decreased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex alongside increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, a pattern consistent with Dietrich's account of reduced self-monitoring during creative flow. It remains one of the most cited demonstrations of transient hypofrontality in an actual creative performance context. Imaging studies published in 2014 and 2016 by Ulrich and colleagues found decreased medial prefrontal cortex activity during flow-like states, which fits Dietrich's account neatly. But presenting this as settled would be misleading because a systematic review published in Consciousness and Cognition in 2022 examined findings across fMRI, EEG, and fNI, RS studies, and concluded the neural signatures of flow are, in the author's own words, too divided to reach a conclusion. The mechanism is plausible and the research is building, but the picture isn't complete. A competing explanation is also worth knowing. The synchronization theory of flow, proposed by Weber and colleagues in 2009, argues that flow arises not from deactivation, but from coordinated synchrony between frontoparietal attention networks and striatal reward systems, with dopamine playing a central role in the reward circuitry that makes the state feel effortlessly motivating. Less about switching regions off and more about separate systems falling into alignment. Both theories remain live hypotheses, and neither has yet dominated the field. There is also the question of what's happening with the default mode network, the set of regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate, that are typically active during self-referential thought and internal monitoring. During flow, the default mode network appears to partially deactivate, and that deactivation may be precisely what the script of self-criticism goes quiet. The script's experience of losing yourself during deep absorption might, on this account, be the default mode network stepping back rather than the self disappearing. So the brain science of flow is genuinely unresolved, and it's worth holding on to that as the next piece of the puzzle arrives, because the next piece is older, more controversial, and considerably more unsettling. In 1985, neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet ran a series of experiments on voluntary movement. Participants were asked to flick their wrist whenever they felt like it, while Libet tracked both their brain activity and the moment they became consciously aware of the intention to move. The result was uncomfortable for a lot of people. The brain's motor preparation signal, the readiness potential, began around 550 milliseconds before a spontaneous action, and conscious awareness of the intention appeared later. The brain had already started the process before the person knew they'd decided to move. Now, the Libet experiments have faced sustained methodological criticism, and the interpretation has been contested for decades. But a 2008 fMRI study by Soon and colleagues pushed the finding further, reporting that activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex could predict a participant's button press decision up to 10 seconds before it entered conscious awareness, at around 60% accuracy. The study involved only 14 participants. It remains a single study, and that 60% figure leaves substantial variance unexplained. But here's the thing. The finding has proved difficult to dismiss entirely, and it connects directly to the question the Richards story raises. If the brain that creates operates partly outside conscious awareness, what role does the conscious self actually play? Is it the author of the work, or something closer to the first audience member? A 2024 paper in Frontiers in Psychology approached this from a different angle entirely. Rather than arguing that flow diminishes agency, the authors proposed that flow might represent something closer to optimal, self-directed action. The felt sense of losing yourself during deep absorption on this account isn't the self disappearing. It might be self-monitoring noise disappearing, the default mode network quieting its editorial function, freeing a skilled person to act more effectively rather than less. The experienced loss of authorship could be an artifact of absent self-criticism, not evidence that the self wasn't running the show. That's one theoretical paper, not yet empirically tested as a primary hypothesis, but the distinction it draws matters, because the two interpretations carry very different implications. One says flow undermines conscious authorship. The other says flow removes the interference that was obstructing it. Richards never resolved this, and probably never tried to. In his memoir, Life, published in 2010, he wrote simply, "I had no idea I'd written it." Whether that's an admission about the limits of conscious creativity or evidence of creativity operating at its most efficient is a question both interpretations can absorb, each in its own way. The sleep dimension adds one more layer worth considering. A 2023 study published in Scientific Reports found that targeted incubation during the transition into sleep, a stage called N1, sometimes called Hypnagogia, was associated with enhanced creative output and greater semantic distance between ideas compared to a waking baseline. It is a single study, likely underpowered by the author's own acknowledgement, but the direction of the finding aligns with a broader picture. The drowsy, drifting state at the edge of sleep may offer something that full wakefulness does not: though the evidence is far from complete. Richards apparently stumbled into that state with a guitar in his hand and a tape recorder running, which does make you wonder how many other ideas dissolved unrecorded into the dark. Here's the honest summary. Flow states, the term Csikszentmihalyi gave to what performers across every discipline have reported for centuries, appear to involve reduced activity in the brain regions associated with conscious self-monitoring, including the prefrontal cortex and elements of the default mode network, though the exact neural signature remains disputed as of the most recent systematic review. The readiness potential research and the predictive fMRI data suggest that conscious awareness frequently follows rather than initiates the brain's preparatory activity, though what that means for genuine agency is still contested philosophically and scientifically. And the evidence connecting sleep, incubation, and creative insight is promising but incomplete. What isn't in dispute is that Richards woke up in 1965 with a song he didn't know he'd written. Whether that makes the unconscious mind the author, or simply the workshop where the real work happens, is the question the research is still trying to answer. If the gap between what people assume about flow states and what the neuroscience actually shows interests you, that's the territory this channel covers.